Now, if you'll recall, I mentioned that this entire sermon series that we're doing is intended to be in two mirroring parts. What we did is we looked at a series of different themes that were mostly rooted in the Old Testament of ways that God interacts with us, ways that He moves us, that He tries to mold us, and ways that He wants us to become restored ultimately to Him as the Creator. These are beautiful themes that we see, and then what we wanted to do is take those themes that we studied about during the season of Epiphany, and now that we are in Lent, take those same themes and look at how Christ reveals Himself through those things. Now, one of the very first themes that we looked at was this idea of purpose and calling. It's something that is very, very important to all of us because it's such a big part of what Christ did with His disciples. So much started with the calling, and God revealed Himself, in fact, through the idea of calling and individuals responding to that. This is something that we see in God's work with fishing. Yes, fishing is one of these metaphors that we end up seeing in the Bible that a lot of people will talk about casually, that, we need to be fishers of men, and, they'll talk about the little symbol of the fish and everything, but they don't ever actually stop to look in the Bible at these instances of fishing and see what's so profound about them. But I actually think this is very, very, very cool. See, the first thing that you end up seeing is at the very beginning of kind of the ministry with Christ and His disciples. You see Christ calling out to Peter and Andrew, and then later on you see Him talking to James and John, sons of Zebedee. And when He's talking with these individuals, He's telling them, put down what you have. Now, there's a subtle difference in between those two groupings of people. We see James and John, sons of Zebedee, they were engaged in preparing their nets, and they were there with their father. And so when Christ said, come and follow after me, these were individuals who they were preparing for something. They had a purpose. They knew what they were going with, and they had, family ties and everything. And then Christ comes and says, I want you to come and follow me. Well, they followed that calling. There's something very admirable there. In the case of Peter and Andrew, it was a little bit different where they were actively engaged in it already. So you can imagine Christ turning around and interrupting them in the middle of doing what is their job and then saying, I want you to come do something totally different that's totally unknown, and then them just dropping everything and doing it. It's that sign of faith that is something that's actually really, really remarkable, and it's so simple in how it's worded, but it's actually incredibly profound. Because what Christ is doing is He's calling these individuals to eschew off everything that they know and all the security they have, the plans that they think they have laid out, and instead surrender to plans that Christ has laid out. That is something that I think if we were to turn around and look at our own lives, we could see that maybe we're kind of deficient in. This idea that Christ calls us to certain things, and then sometimes we're hesitant. Sometimes we want to stick with what we know. Sure, maybe it's not as good as what God's doing, but it's ours. And sometimes people decide that's what they want. Now, there is another time that we end up seeing this fishing metaphor pop up, and it actually is on the exact opposite end of the Gospels. When you turn around and you look at what occurs after Christ has been resurrected, you see another example of all the disciples who are fishing. And as they're fishing, they have all of their nets on one side of the boat, and Christ calls out, with the disciples not noticing that it's Jesus Christ, and asks basically, how's the fishing? And they say, not all that great. And then Christ tells them to throw the nets on the other side. And then after throwing the nets on the other side, they haul in more fish than they can barely handle. And in the midst of this metaphor, you have something that's a little bit different than the beginning. Because in the beginning, what you had is you had a picture of God calling, and then the individuals responding to that. So it was God's calling and the individuals sacrificing and cooperatively engaging in this calling that Christ had put in their life. And as a result, they got to experience the blessings of knowing Christ and experiencing that glory of everything Christ would do in His life. At the end, what you have is something that's a little bit different. You end up having Christ doing a thing with very little work at all on the behalf of the disciples, and then God insisting on Himself and directing and showing Himself. If you were to turn around and get all theological with this, so I won't go too deep into this because I don't want to lose people, but some of you may be familiar with some of these little fights that exist between people who say that they are a belief system of being Calvinist, which is a lot of predestination and divine election, or people who are Arminian or maybe Wesleyan, people who are a little bit more into free will, the idea that, God calls on us and then we have free will to decide to whether to be obedient to that call. When I sit here and I look at these two metaphors of fishing, to me, it kind of breaks down why I don't think people should get so wrapped up in these distinctions. And if you're hearing this and thinking, don't worry, Pastor, I don't get wrapped up in these distinctions, then good, keep that up. But if you've ever been around people who do get wrapped up in these things, then I would encourage this. When you look at both of these metaphors, what I see is almost an image of both of those ideologies. The idea that God does a thing, that God directs, and it's through God's divine election in this moment that He is going to do a great thing, that He says, here is the harvest. I have called you to do this thing, so I'm directing you to go do this, and then look at what I will do through my power. And that's kind of what you see there at the very end of the Gospels. In the very beginning of the Gospels, you see a more cooperative thing. You see God calling and people responding. And rather than people getting wrapped up in their own ideologies and categories and labels when it comes to philosophy and theology and things of that nature, what it seems like is more important is what we end up doing with our lives. Okay, fine. God called you and you responded. Or maybe God elected you and then now you have been elected. So what? What are you doing? Are you actually gathering fish and becoming a fisher of men? Are you becoming this new creation that God has called you to? Or are you just trying to live out the label of being a good little Christian? Now, one of the things that's cool about that whole thing with the fisherman type analogy is that it shows this idea of parallelism, that occurs between the beginning of Christ's ministry and the end of His ministry. Let me show you another really cool example of parallelism that exists in the Bible when it comes to what Christ is doing when He calls us. Stephen is an individual that was very, very, very young, but yet, despite being very, very young, he was used for this tremendous thing. Now, most people will know Stephen because he is the first martyr that we end up seeing in the New Testament. But when he is being martyred, it really begins with this confrontation between him and the religious elite, the Sanhedrin. And as these individuals are hearing him prophesy, they become enraged and as a result end up ultimately killing Stephen. But what you see is this really fascinating thing. You see Stephen launches into this thing and he starts talking about these events that took place with the golden calf back in Exodus. Now, the very quick version, you guys will read this here in a second in your small groups, is that God was descended, His presence on the top of Mount Sinai, and Moses was meeting with God, and the people of Israel got impatient. Despite the fact that they are literally looking at the presence of Almighty God in front of them, they're so stuck in this philosophy and this mindset of Egypt that they're thinking, I gotta have my God that I can see and touch and worship. So they create a golden calf out of their own belongings. And as a result of creating that, there is now this confrontation that occurs between, God and then, Moses trying to intercess on behalf of these rebellious people. You see Stephen talk about this, and it's a fascinating thing for him to bring up. But what you're seeing him bring up is the fact that the heart of the Hebrew people is something that individuals still cling to. The way he words it is that people had turned back to Egypt in their heart. And he's taking that and he's pointing at the Pharisees and all these other individuals that are confronting him, saying, look, you're doing the same thing. I think this is utterly fascinating because it's this idea of Egypt, which is slavery. It's the embodiment of bondage that is being used as something to say that you, through your own stubbornness, that through your own insistence that you know how everything works in life, you have clinged on to Egypt. And what we end up seeing in Exodus is this picture of a people who were looking at the unknown, at what God was going to do with them, and they were terrified at that. But they knew Egypt. Egypt was familiar. And so they kept wanting to go back to Egypt. And so what Stephen is doing is he's really confronting them with the idea that you guys want to control everything and you're not being made into what God is making you into. It kind of goes back to what we were talking about in that first purpose and calling lesson that we did at the very beginning of this series, the idea of the clay trying to dictate to the potter what it's going to become. Well, the Pharisees were doing that, and inevitably what ends up happening is they end up getting called out, becoming enraged, and ultimately killing Stephen. But in this moment, something beautiful happens. Stephen effectively takes on the role of Moses, because what he does is he's looking at these stiff-necked people, this language that he uses and that Moses uses as well. And he's looking at them, he's confronting them. He's telling them the truth, just like Moses did. And then ultimately, right before he loses his life, he prays penitence on behalf to intercede for these stiff-necked people, just as Stephen did right before he died. But that's not the only cool connection in here, because I want you to see this other cool connection. When you read it here in a second, what you're going to see is that there's another character in the story. Depending on how good your biblical literacy is, you may know that this whole time Moses is dealing with the golden calf, there's Joshua. And Joshua is with him and is aware that all this is happening. And ultimately, Joshua is the one who would end up taking the Hebrew people onto the promised land. Well, when you see Stephen being martyred, what you see is this little mention in there that says the robes of all the Pharisees were laid at the feet of an individual named Saul, who is the individual that would later become Paul, who would become an individual who would kind of embody Joshua, but New Testament. He would carry on the early church into kind of this new world that it was going to be living in. When you look at that parallel nature in between what is taking place in the Old Testament and the New Testament, what you have is this very clear image of God pointing at individuals who are clinging to their old life and saying, it may be familiar, it may be what you know, but it's not what I have intended. That is slavery, that is bondage, that is death. And I have intended for something that is a sweet land of milk and honey. I've intended for you glory that you cannot possibly imagine. I'm the potter and you are the clay. That's what God has in store for us. But yet, even though we know that that is what God has in store for us, even though we see all of the testimony, even though we've seen it in the lives of people around us that God has glory in store for us, if we're being honest, in our hearts, many of us still cling on to Egypt. I know this is running a little bit longer, but to me, this is just such a phenomenal, profound point to make. So many individuals have this idea that a life dedicated to Christ is a life of rules and restrictions and all these things. And they're not seeing that that life that so many Christians talk about is something that should be the natural side effect of the freedom that you feel. Not that you do these things because those are the rigid rules you have to do. It's that God wants to change your heart and make you a new creation. And the fruit of that new creation is going to be virtue, is going to be this life that looks so different from the world around us. The world wants to try to give you contentment in things that you can know and you can understand. But those things are not things that are going to lead to life. Those things are going to be temporary reprieves from life's troubles at best. And at worst, it is going to be something that is going to continue to drag you down, something that is going to anchor you to this world, something that is going to cause you to build up a sense of confidence in things that are going to fail and decay over time. But God is something that is different. God is freedom and He is glory. That when God died on a cross, He didn't die on a cross to say, now you have a new set of rules. He died on a cross so that you could be free from the things of Egypt. Egypt is that thing in your life you can't kick. Egypt is that habit that you can't break. Egypt is that guilt that you can't get away from. Egypt is a world that is oppressing you and that is trying to tell you how you have to be or how you have to do or the things that you need to care about in order to be a good person. Egypt is about all of the things in your life that you feel like are musts, or else you won't be good enough. But Christ is freedom, that through the cross, you have been bought out of that slavery so that you can know Christ. And so I guess the so what here is to understand that God's calling in your life and that God's purpose for you is not a calling and a purpose that leads to another set of chains. It is something that frees you from all of that so that you can go into something that is greater than you could have ever imagined back when you lived in the land of Egypt. The only thing it requires that is oh so hard for so many of us is to be willing to let go of becoming the creation that we can imagine. Because the reality is that Moses had no idea what he was going to become when God was speaking to him through the burning bush. David had no idea what God was going to do through him whenever Samuel came and anointed him. Jonah didn't know what was going to happen whenever God came to him and said, I want you to go and talk to the people at Nineveh. All of these different individuals in the Bible we could go over and over and over and over did not know what God had in store for them, but yet us, knowing the end of the story, we know the mighty things that God did in these individuals' lives. And God also has a plan for you, and it is to be a part of His masterpiece of glory, the restoration of His kingdom. That is what I want to live for. My question for you is, what are you living for? Are you living for Egypt, or are you living for something more? That's our lesson we got for today. I hope you're able to get something out of it. Until we can meet again, God bless.